So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're setting up your soldering iron is find a space that's wide enough that you're not touching other items on the counter or the table that you're at. In particular, this section here gets very hot when the soldering iron is inside and at rest. So make sure that your area is clear. Second thing you want to do is find an outlet to plug this into. Let the soldering iron warm up. And then the third thing you're going to want to do is make sure that this has been soaked in water so that your sponge is wet and you can clean off your soldering iron onto the sponge. Okay, and before you do any actual soldering, you're going to want to do a process that's called tinning. And what tinning does is it sort of prepares the solder tip to be ready to solder. And the way you tin is that you pull some of your solder out. So all of our soldering irons come with the solder reel. And as you, if you touch the tip of the soldering iron to the solder, it puts a little bit on there, and you can kind of clean it off if you want. But the idea is that it's been sort of coated a little bit with some of the solder, and that's called tinning. And that just gets it ready for soldering. Okay, this is just a little reminder about wire stripping. So these are our wire cutters, and remember that if you want to just cut off wire from the length of spool that you have, you just use this to cut. But when you're ready to strip the wire, this happens to be 20 gauge wire, and on here you'll see a little 20. You just place it there, and maybe about a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch of length. You clip it in and pull, and that strips off the plastic but leaves the exposed metal, the actual wire, which we'll use to solder. Okay, in this video we're going to look at soldering the wires for the motor. And so what you'll notice here is that all the motors come, some of them might have a wire already attached to them, but in this case these ones do not. And so you have one side or the other. Right now I'm using black and red just as positive and negative, but keep in mind that the motor can spin both ways, so it doesn't really matter which way you hook it in, you just have to pick one. So I'm going to pick this one, and I've taken some wire, and I'm going to put it through one end, like that, and I'm going to fold it over so that I get a good, nice, tight feel, and this is what I'm going to solder. And then I'll do that for the other side as well, and when I come back we'll actually do the soldering. Okay, so the key about soldering is that you want to, first of all, keep in mind that this tip up to the very end here is very hot, so you don't want to touch any of that. You only want to touch the handle here, and even this can get a little warm. But the key is that you want to heat up the area that needs the solder first, and then touch the solder to it, and the solder will melt. So hopefully you're going to be able to see that here. I'm going to do this. I'm going to pull enough solder out so that it just kind of hangs over the motor where I'm going to add my solder. And notice how I'm holding them. You can use a partner or a friend to hold the two pieces while you solder if you'd like. I'm just doing this by myself. But I'm going to hold the tip of the solder against these two areas just lightly to get them to warm up. And then I'm going to touch the solder up against it. And what it's going to do is going to melt this area here. And I'll see if I can zoom in a little bit. But it's melted the area right between and where the wire is connected to the lead from the motor. And so I've got a connection that's really sort of almost like melted wax. And I'm going to let it sit there for a bit. It takes maybe, I don't know, 5-10 seconds. And then it's really hard. Doesn't really come off. And so the key is you want to make sure that you have enough solder that it's a solid connection, and that you don't have wire just sticking out anywhere. This is a pretty solid connection. All right, now I'm going to do that to both ends. Okay, so now I have both ends soldered. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing the soldering, you're going to want to heat the area, then bring the solder to it, the solder melts, and then you want to pull away from the solder before you pull the iron away. In other words, let the solder that's coming out of the reel move away from that first, so that you're just left with what you see here, and then move the soldering iron away. And the reason you want to do that is because you don't want the solder to stick to the iron. So just a good practice tip to keep in mind. Okay, so for the incandescent light bulb, you're going to need one of these holders. I've got a bunch of them. You can take one of those. And so just like the motor and just like the LED, there are two sides. And so this one wire will go on this side, one wire will go on this side. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative from the battery. It'll work in either direction, just kind of like the motor does. The one thing I will give you as a tip, though, is when you're stripping the wire for this, make the strip a little longer. And the reason is you're going to want to curve around the entire screw and then screw down onto it to get a firm connection. So make this longer so that you can actually get around the entire circumference of that screw. Okay. Just a tiny follow-up. You're going to want it to look something like that. Okay, and that's what you'll screw in. Okay, in the video about motors, I mentioned that that there is a positive and a negative, but all that really matters for in terms of the motors is that you hook it up one way, the motor will turn one direction. You hook it up the opposite way, and the motor will turn in the other direction. That's not the case with LEDs. LEDs will only work in one direction. And so here's one LED, it's a red LED, and it has two leads coming out of it from the bottom. And the longer lead, just remember, of any LED, so that in this case the one on the left, is the positive one. So the longer lead is what needs to connect to the positive side. And so what I've done is, since we always think of red as positive, I've just gotten red wire, and I'm going to hook that to the positive side, and I have black wire, and I'm going to hook that to the negative side. And I'm going to create tiny little hooks in there too that you're going to see in a moment, just to make it easier for me to connect the leads to the LED. Okay, and so here's the LED with the ends of it bent a little bit to be able to hook those other wires in. And I've left them in the same way. In other words, I've left them so that the left side is longer, just as it was originally, so that I'll remember that that's the positive side. And I'm going to hook these two together this way, like that, and squeeze them together like that, and that's what I'll solder. And I'll do the same with the other side. Okay, I just wanted to introduce one more element when working with LEDs. This is called a resistor. And as you can see, the resistor has these little bands, these colored bands on them, and those are a code to tell you what size resistor this is. And so while I won't spend a lot of time talking about that during class, I will show you how we'll use this resistor as one piece in our circuit to be able to reduce the amount of power that's going through those LEDs so that they won't burn out, so that they'll last longer. Okay, that's it for resistors for now. Okay, and to complete your circuit, you have this 9-volt battery connector, and in most cases it's not going to matter if you have a motor or an incandescent lamp which side you hook to the start of your circuit. On the LEDs, remember that red is positive, okay, just for the LED circuit blocks. And so you're just going to you're going to complete your circle for your circuit. In other words, the very end of your circuit, whatever it is going to hook there, and then the other end is going to hook to your switch, okay? And your switch will then hook to this side. So imagine, let's see if I can bring one in. Okay, so here's an illustration. These haven't been soldered down, but to give you an idea of how this circuit works. So again, if you can picture it, it's just a circle, okay? Whether that's a motor, an incandescent light, or an LED, or multiple LEDs in series, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is that you have a positive end coming out of the battery, goes to your devices, comes back to the switch, and the switch goes back to the battery. And the reason for that is so that you can turn on and off your device using your switch. So this basically cuts power off anytime you press it. Okay, so that's the completion of your circuit. And you're going to want to make sure that you've measured out all the lengths of wire that you need prior to putting everything together so that you don't have to go back and recut any wire. Okay, and the last thing about cleanup for the soldering iron, you're going to want to unplug it from the wall and let it sit for a while because it's got to cool. And then you're going to wrap up the wire and pack it back to where you originally got it. The other key thing about anytime you're working with solder, you want to wash your hands if you've touched the solder itself. And you also, while the soldering action is occurring, you're going to want to remember not to breathe in the fumes. You're just going to want to blow those away when you see them coming up to you. Okay?